He served as the senior architectural historian for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, where he was employed for 40 years, and he still works part-time there. He's also a member of the Advisory Council for the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art in New York, the ICAA. I'm sure you're familiar with their fantastic programs, lectures, and YouTube videos. And he lectures for ICAA on classical and traditional architecture. Several of Calder's video lectures are available on YouTube, where they have received more than 1 million views, and well worth it too. In 2008, Calder received the Secretary of the Interior's Preservation Award for service to state preservation programs. And in 2017, he received the Virginia AIA Honor Award for significant contributions to the understanding of Virginia's built environment. His publications include Lost Virginia, Virginia Landmarks of Black History, and the Virginia Landmarks Register. Thank you so much, Calder, for addressing us tonight.
Why should Americans care about an architect who lived so long ago and far away? You know, the average American has never heard of Palladio. Well, as we will see, Palladio's influence, both direct and indirect, appears in a myriad of unexpected places and continues to offer design resources for contemporary architecture. But before we get to America, we need to run a quick background check on Palladio. Palladio's real name was Andrea di Pietro della Gondola. He was born in Padua in 1508 and began training as a stonemason at age 13. When he was 29, he made the acquaintance of Count Giorgio Trissino, who hired Palladio to work on the loggia of his new classical-style villa. Trissino recognized a special talent in Andrea and became his mentor and sponsored his education as an architect. He also gave him the name Palladio, which means wise one. It's a reference to Pallas Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. Palladio's education stirred in him an intense interest in the architecture of ancient Rome, where he made several visits and familiarized himself with the ancient ruins, most of which were in a pretty sad state, half buried, as you see here. And this is more or less how Palladio saw Rome. Now, in addition to the ruins, an important factor in Palladio's architectural education was the ancient treatise of Vitruvius, the only architectural treatise surviving from Roman times. And a medieval copy of Vitruvius's treatise was discovered in a Swiss monastery in 1414. It contained detailed instructions for designing the ancient classical architectural orders, Doric, Corinthian, Ionic, and so on, and many other architectural considerations such as siting, materials, acoustics, and so on. Well, this veritable how-to manual enabled Renaissance architects to design literate classical style buildings of their own. Now, of course, Palladio designed many fine buildings, but until the 20th century, few Americans ever saw any of Palladio's buildings firsthand. So from our standpoint, the most important introduction to Palladio for Americans was Palladio's treatise. His seminal work, I Quattro Libri della Architettura, or the 4 books on architecture, published in 1570, is probably the most influential book on architecture ever written. And for brevity, I will refer to it in this talk as just the 4 books. Now, much of the material in this book is the result of Palladio's measuring the ruins of ancient Roman buildings himself and learning the proportions and detailing of the architectural orders, the different types of Roman columns. This is not Palladio on the ladder, but it's the best I could come up with as somebody studying ancient architecture. Well, certainly, other 16th century architects produced books on Roman architecture, but Palladio's drawings and descriptions particularly his drawings and descriptions for constructing standardized versions of the orders in the four books were far more instructive. And many later architectural treatises, particularly 18th century English works, obtained their information and inspiration from Palladio's treatise. Now, the availability of various editions of Palladio's treatise in 18th century America is a very complex subject. Anyway, editions of Palladio's The Four Books could be found in the libraries of Boston, New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson, Palladio's foremost advocate in America, called Palladio's treatise the Bible, and he advised a college to, quote, get it and stick with it. Now I'm showing Jefferson with the title page of the 1715 Giacomo Leone edition of Palladio's treatise. This was the first English language translation of the four books, and this edition was Jefferson's principal reference for Palladio. But during his lifetime, Jefferson owned as many as 7 editions of Palladio. Well, we'll talk more about Jefferson later, but I need to mention here that as a graduate of the UVA School of Architecture, I'm morally obligated to include Jefferson in my lectures. So we start with book 1 of the 4 books. We see on the title page that Palladio begins this section with this statement of purpose, pointed out, quote, a brief discourse on the 5 orders and those rules which are essential to building. This is the meat of book 1. And the clarity and precision of Palladio's drawings, such as these of the Ionic order, coupled with the instructions of how to compose each order, have made book 1 a leading textbook on classical design for students, architects, builders, and craftsmen ever since. Now, we have a rare colonial Virginia example of where an unknown craftsman referenced Palladio's illustrations in executing the Ionic order for his pilaster capitals. This Ionic order is unique to Palladio's Book 1. It's defined by the foliated ornament between the volutes or scrolls, which are pointed out here. And these pilasters decorate the Marmion parlor woodwork in the New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it was installed in the 1920s. And although absent its parlor paneling, the 1750s Marmion house survives in Virginia's King George County. Former owners of Marmion sold the woodwork to the Met in 1916, over 100 years ago. Now, Virginia's most conspicuous use of Book 1's plates is seen in Jefferson's design for the University of Virginia. Jefferson was concerned about the lack of architectural literacy among Virginians, particularly college students. Still true. So Jefferson determined to make his university design serve, among other things, as a textbook on classical architecture. His design had the facades of the 10 pavilions or professors' residences lining the central lawn display different versions of the classical orders. Jefferson wrote that they will serve as, quote, specimens for the architectural lectures. Students would thus be daily exposed to literate classical works. The orders for 7 of the pavilions were based on specific ancient ruins which Jefferson took from publications other than Palladio's. However, Jefferson selected the orders for 3 of the pavilions directly from Book 1 of Palladio's 4 books. So, Pavilion 3's portico employs Palladio's standard Corinthian order from Palladio's Book 1. And the source for each order on each of the pavilion drawings, outlined in tiny hand, is Jefferson has written, I don't know if you can see that, Corinthian Palladio. All right, Pavilion 5 is the Ionic order from Palladio's Book 1, and Pavilion 7 is the Doric order from Book 1. Now, I could discuss UVA for the rest of the evening, but we need to proceed to Book 2 of the 4 books. We see written on the title page of Book 2, quote, which contains drawings of many houses by him within and outside the city. To our eyes today, his villa designs have such a familiar character that it's hard to appreciate how innovative they were at the time. For instance, here is Palladio's design for the Villa Amo. To us, it looks like a perfectly normal, relatively restrained, classical style dwelling. But note the front. It has a classical pedimented portico. Palladio was the first to actively promote the use of the classical portico for domestic buildings. And the column portico was a signature motif for ancient Roman temples and public buildings. The Romans normally didn't put porticos on their houses. Palladio assumed they did. Nevertheless, Palladio's use of this stately ancient form to dignify the appearance of rural dwellings was a profoundly influential idea, especially in America. Well, here is the Villa Amo today, built in 1560, some 460 years ago. As you can see, except for the portico, it's a pretty plain house, actually a big farmhouse. The upper level doesn't contain bedrooms, but is a grain storage area, and the ramp is for getting farm wagons up to the door to unload the grain. But the portico gives the signal that this is the home of an important family. The portico was developed by the ancients for buildings to house gods. It was meant to inspire awe. It did in ancient times and still does today. Okay, we now see an 1820s Virginia house with a nearly identical Tuscan portico. This house, called Frascati, was designed by John M. Perry, a builder who had worked for Jefferson at the University of Virginia, where he learned the classical language and likely had access to Jefferson's copy of Palladio's treatise. Here, the portico sends the message that this house was built for an important person, which it was, Philip Barber, a Supreme Court justice. Removing the portico and the house loses most of its visual and psychological punch. And this bookended photo of Amo and Frascati shows how closely the two porticos match. So appreciate the fact that the two houses are separated by 2.5 centuries and nearly 4,500 miles. So thanks to Palladio, porticoed houses and mansions abound in this country. And thanks to both Jefferson and the workmen he trained, we have other noteworthy porticoed mansions here in Virginia. James Madison consulted his friend Thomas Jefferson on the execution of the portico added in 1799 to his home Montpelier, specifically asking Jefferson about the coating on the columns. Jefferson replied, quote, most of the columns on those fine buildings erected by Palladio are of brick covered with stucco and stand perfectly, unquote. Montpelier's portico and some of the additions was the work of James Dinsmore and John Nielsen, both of whom worked for Jefferson on the construction of UVA, where they were perfectly familiar with the classical language. Now, another Tuscan portico distinguishes Astuteville, an 1830s plantation mansion, both designed and built by James Dinsmore. And the character of a Palladian villa is infused in the elegantly refined West End, a porticoed 3-part composition in rural Louisa County, complete with formally placed matching dependencies. West End dates from 1849. Its Palladian finesse is due to Malcolm Crawford, who also worked at UVA, where he too learned the classical language via Palladio. So, if you want to make your house important looking, add a portico. The portico remains a status symbol for houses. This 1930s house is in Alexandria, Virginia, but it could be in any American city. This is it. Successful people live in houses that look like this. The portico signals that you've made it. Now, a bold expression of success close by is the 1913 Blair House here on Monument Avenue, just next door. Its tall portico echoes the Palladian spirit. And the portico can also give a signal that you've really made it. This is Linwood Hall, the Widener Mansion outside Philadelphia, one of the grandest houses built in America. And I should add that architects of the contemporary New Classicism movement are producing handsome porticoed works today. We see a recently completed summer home in North Carolina. So we can thank Palladio for this architectural innovation, or blame him, perhaps unfairly, for pompous, illiterate uses of the classical language. Sadly, many try to play the game without knowing the rules, particularly Palladio's rules. But good or bad, great or small, the portico lends a dwelling's owner a certain feeling of achievement and prestige, even in the most pedestrian structures. Well, Palladio also pioneered in the use of the two-tiered portico, either projecting or engaged. He illustrated its use in 10 of his published designs. We see 3 samples here. So we might ask, where did Palladio get this idea? Well, he doesn't tell us exactly, but perhaps from the superimposed orders of the Colosseum, which he certainly saw. And the more likely influence was that of the two-tiered courtyards of nearby Renaissance palazzos. Whatever, Palladio made stunning use of the two-tiered form, as seen in this stately Villa Canaro designed by him, as well as the Villa Pisani at Montignana, which has an engaged portico on its facade and a recessed, which means it doesn't project, and a recessed two-tiered portico on the rear elevation, both designed by Palladio. Now, a similar recessed portico defines Drayton Hall, built around 1750 in South Carolina. Drayton is one of America's earliest expressions of Palladianism, and Drayton Hall's recessed portico echoes that on Palladio's Villa Pisani. And we know that John Drayton, for whom Drayton Hall was built, owned a copy of Isaac Ware's 1788 English language edition of Palladio's The Four Books. And I might note that the Ware edition of Palladio's treatise is available from Dover reprints for about $31. It's in English and it's still very popular. Well, probably the country's most elegant use of the two-tiered portico is that on Charleston's Miles Bruton House of 1769. The use of the two-tiered portico continued well into decades, the subsequent decades here in America. And we see its use in scores of examples. It was particularly favored in the South, where it provided 2 levels of shaded seating, as on Hope Plantation in North Carolina. I'm looking at this from an angle. Is that not quite in focus? It's good. All right, I'm just seeing it sideways. All right, good. Thank you. I'm not going blind. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's fascination with Palladio inspired him to employ a two-tiered portico on both sides of his first version of Monticello. And these paired images show that Jefferson's design was likely inspired by Palladio's illustration of the Villa Canaro, which you just saw, but on much smaller scale. And this model shows how Monticello might have looked then. But as the result of Jefferson's many remodelings, this, of course, is not how Monticello looks today. So if you need a quick reference, just check your nickel. Well, with or without Jefferson's influence, the two-tiered portico became very popular in Virginia. Shirley received a stately two-tiered portico on both its land and river fronts in a 1770s remodeling of this 1738 mansion. Two-tiered porticos defined a number of Virginia's federal period houses, including Anfield in Clark County. Magnolia Grange in Chesterfield Courthouse has a two-tiered portico with square columns, rather than more standard round ones. Belle Grove in King George County was built in 1792 and originally had just an engaged portico on its riverfront. It was overlaid in 1839 with this two-tiered portico. In Richmond's antebellum period, two-tiered porticos were popular for the rear or garden fronts of downtown mansions. A surviving example is the 1844 Greek Revival Barrett House at 5th and Main. Here, the square columns extend the full height of the two tiers. And a dignified example of a new classicism work with a two-tiered portico is the Wyatt House by Alvin Home near Pittsburgh, built in the 1990s. Now, one of Palladio's more modest villas is the Villa Cerceno, dating from 1545. This is its facade, illustrated in Book 2. Instead of columns, its portico has a loggia, or a three-arch arcade. And here is the Villa Cerceno today. And Palladio's use of a central arcaded loggia for Cerceno was picked up by James Gibbs, one of England's leading architects of the 18th century Anglo-Palladian movement in Britain. And we see it employed in an English country house design published by Gibbs in his highly influential 1728 treatise, A Book of Architecture. And this Gibbs design served as the inspiration for Mount Airy, the 1750s Virginia plantation house of John Taylor. And thanks to Gibbs, Mount Airy is one of America's purest expressions of 18th century Anglo-Palladianism. And we see a contemporary use of the arcaded loggia as a shopfront on a building in Williamsburg's Merchant Square, dating from 2004, still going. Now, another villa design published in Palladio's Book 2 is the Villa Pisani at Bagnola. And we see Palladio's main elevation and the colonnades connecting the residence to the dependencies. But for some reason, Palladio didn't provide an illustration of the villa's equally interesting riverfront, which is pointed out here on the plan. Well, thankfully, an illustration of the riverfront appeared in a 1783 treatise by Ottavio Bertotti Scamozzi, a great admirer of Palladio, who illustrated all his works in his publication. As you can see, it features an arcaded loggia like Cerceno, but flanked by two-story single-bay pavilions. And here are two images of the villa's riverfront today, showing the loggia. Now, this scheme provided design inspiration for two important American works. The first one in large scale, this is the scheme. The first one in large scale is the headquarters of the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., completed in 1910. It features an arcaded loggia between square two windowless pavilions. And finished nearly 100 years later is the 2003 residence designed by Robert A.M. Stern Architects, looking quite at home in Palo Alto, California. I'm waiting. All right. Put the fire in. And here, keeping the Palladian spirit alive into the 21st century. Now, okay, we'll take another look at Mount Airy as seen in this aerial view. It shows the main house with hyphens or links connecting to attached dependencies. And this layout illustrates another innovation in Palladio's villa designs, and that is the breaking of a dwelling's mass into several connected sections. And Palladio's Villa Barbaro, its five-part composition, expresses this scheme. It has a center section containing the residence, then arcaded hyphens fronting service areas, and they link to the terminal dependencies, a stable at one end and wine storage at the other. And here is Barbaro today. By incorporating the service areas into a formal composition, a villa, even a modest one, could be made a distinctive work of architecture, avoiding the clutter of a bunch of detached, scattered outbuildings. Now, Palladio's five-part villa designs became especially popular in 18th century England and inspired architects to produce their own versions of the form. A classic example of Britain's many five-part Anglo-Palladian country houses is the 1770s Basildon Hall by architect John Carr. And this five-part scheme, it started by Palladio, struck a chord with Americans. An early example of an American five-part Palladian style house is Battersea near Petersburg. This was built in the 1760s for John Bannister, first mayor of Petersburg. And Battersea's design may have been influenced by Thomas Jefferson, since Jefferson and Bannister were both friends and distant relatives. Now, the house underwent an early 19th century remodeling when its brick walls were stucco. Okay, as part of the Anglo-Palladian movement, many lesser-known English architects got on the act and started publishing their own Palladian-style designs. We see one published by the English architect William Halfpenny that kind of looks like Battersea. Halfpenny's books were inexpensive and available to builders in America, including Virginia and maybe even Petersburg. Now, a somewhat provincial version of the five-part scheme is Carsbrook in Albemarle County, dating from the 1780s. This house was built for Thomas Carr, half-brother of Dabney Carr, Thomas Jefferson's close friend. And Jefferson may have influenced the use of the Palladian format here, but he can't be blamed for the somewhat awkward proportions. A more polished version of the five-part configuration is Y House on Maryland's eastern shore. It's a strong composition of pediments, a pediment topping the center section, pediments on each of the wings, and a pediment on the entrance porch. Y House was completed in 1784 for Edward Lloyd IV and is still owned by, too far, and still owned by his descendants. Well, back in Virginia, there it is a cunningly countrified example of American Palladianism. Its memorable name, Hobson's Choice, causes one to wonder what led to that choice. Well, we're not sure. And this five-part house dates from 1794 and was the home of Dr. Edward Field, an Edinburgh-educated physician. And I might add, the front porch is not original. Now, our foremost example of Jeffersonian Palladianism and a commanding use of the five-part layout is, of course, Bremo, occupying the crest of a ridge above the James River. Bremo has been called the best Jeffersonian house not designed by Jefferson. This design was the product of a collaboration between John Nielsen, the UVA builder previously mentioned, and Bremo's owner, General John Hartwell Cox, who had a keen interest in architecture. And Bremo's entrance front opposite also displays a strong Palladian character. We see this restrained dignity echoed in both Palladio's villas Amo and Cerceno. Now, a variation on the five-part house is the seven-part house. This drawing in book 2 of the 4 books is Palladio's concept of an ancient Roman villa. Now, later research has shown that Roman villas probably didn't look like this, but Palladio's interpretation was an influential composition nonetheless. Now, hold this image in your mind. Another important figure in the 18th century Anglo-Palladian movement was Robert Morris, author of the 1750 English pattern book, Select Architecture. This book was popular in America because it offered designs for informed, though relatively modest, Palladian-style houses. And we see here from the book Morris's own variation on Palladio's ancient villa design, a 7-part scheme for a farmhouse. Now, it's often claimed that Morris's design was the inspiration for Brandon. Nathaniel Harrison's 18th century plantation house on the James River. Now, Jefferson owned Morris's book, and it's Harrison family legend that Jefferson designed Brandon as a wedding present for Nathaniel Harrison. It's not documented, but maybe. And Jefferson was a participant in Harrison's wedding. Even so, I strongly feel that Brandon more likely was inspired by Palladio's interpretation of an ancient Roman villa. I'll let you all be the judge. Jefferson knew this image well himself. And as for another Virginia work, maybe remotely inspired by Palladio's ancient villa design, I hesitate to mention, but it's this ad in the Richmond paper. Well, who knows? I mean, could have been. Now, if we focus on the center section of Palladio's ancient villa design, we see a two-story center section with one-story wings. Now, this may have influenced Robert Morris's design for what he called a little building intended for retirement. We should be so lucky. Also published in Morris's book, Select Architecture. This book was relatively inexpensive and was available in colonial America. And as noted, Jefferson owned the book. Architectural historians have determined that Morris's three-part design, having a pedimented two-story center section and one-story wings, was the inspiration for a number of dwellings classified as what architectural historians have termed Piedmont Palladian. Now, we could have a whole lecture on Piedmont Palladian houses. They are scattered throughout the South, and I will show a sampling here. Most noted is the William Finney House in colonial Williamsburg, built around 1790. And this has sometimes been attributed to Jefferson, but never documented. And we have Fortsville in Sussex County, dating from around 1780. This was the home of John Young Mason, who held the offices of U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Attorney General, and Minister to France. And Oak Lawn, built in 1822 in Charlottesville, is a noteworthy example of Jeffersonian Palladianism. Its design is attributed to James Dinsmore, who we heard about earlier, who assisted with the construction of the University of Virginia nearby, and designed and built other Virginia works. And far out in southwest Virginia, in Tazewell County, is Chimney Rock Farm. This house was built in 1843 and is no less Palladian than the previously mentioned houses. And if we dip down into North Carolina, we find the endearing 1807 Sally Billy House with a one-bay center section. And this house is now a museum in the historic Halifax complex. The 1823 Mount Nebo near Milledgeville, Georgia, sported a two-tiered portico. Regrettably, the house burned in 1940. And sometimes the Palladian character can be casually, if not crudely, grasped in buildings such as this Southside Virginia abode. Who knows? Well, happily, the form is not extinct. The form of Fairfax and Salmons recently produced this striking work of new classicism, not in the South, but in Connecticut, proving that the Palladian form is still a design resource. So far, we haven't mentioned Palladio's most famous work, the Villa Rotunda. We see Palladio's design in book 2 of the 4 books. Now, Palladio died before the house was finished, and Vincenzo Scamozzi, a pupil of Palladio, completed it, but with a lower dome. The Villa Rotunda has been the subject of several adaptations, mostly in England. Probably the most faithful is Merworth Castle, designed by Colin Campbell and built in the 1720s. Astonishingly, the most recent replica is in, of all places, Palestine, near Nablus, the creation of a very wealthy West Bank residence. and it's pretty well done. Now, it would be an understatement to say that Thomas Jefferson admired the Villa Rotunda. So eager was Jefferson to have a version of this famous design on these shores that he anonymously submitted his own design of a rotunda house in the design competition for the residence of the United States president. This is Jefferson's entry, and his design called for glass ribs serving as skylights in the dome, pointed out here. This was a pretty cool idea, but it would have leaked like a waterfall. And obviously, Jefferson was much disappointed when his design was passed over in favor of James Hoban's for the White House. George Washington preferred Hoban's design, and you don't argue with Washington. But Hoban's design is also an expression of Anglo-Palladianism. Here we see Hoban's original drawing for the White House compared with the design by James Gibbs below it. All right, this brings us to Book 3 of Palladio's treatise. We see on the title page to Book 3 that this section deals with ways, meaning road building, also bridges, piazzas, basilicas, and gisti, which are athletic facilities. I'll deal with just one feature from the book, and a ubiquitous one. The feature or motif is lavishly displayed in the arcades that Palladio added to the medieval basilica in Vicenza. This is his elevation drawing from Book 3 of the 4 books. And this motif is what we call in America a Palladian arch. It consists of a round top arch flanked by narrow flat top arches. And Palladio's use of it here has greatly popularized this motif. In Britain, it is primarily termed, or generally termed, a Venetian arch, and it's also called a Serliana, especially in Europe. Now, the term Serliana derives from Sebastiano Serlio, the predecessor of Palladio, who published several designs for Venetian palazzos featuring this motif, although it's uncertain whether any of these designs were ever built. Now, Palladio and Serlio didn't invent this form. The Romans used it. We see it in a fragment of a Roman temple dedicated to the Emperor Hadrian in Ephesus in Turkey. So how did the so-called Palladian arch get to be widely known in this country? Certainly few people owned Palladio's treatise in our colonial period. The main sources for the architectural details seen on many of our colonial buildings are the numerous pattern books and builders' manuals produced in quantity by English architects. We find the Palladio motif illustrated, for instance, in Batty Langley's Workman's Treasury of Designs, a pattern book widely used by, as the title says, colonial workmen and builders. And note, being English, Langley calls it Venetian windows. I don't know if you can see that. Bottom line, the Palladian arch in one form or another is most everywhere, so be on the lookout for it. We find it on Mount Pleasant in Philadelphia. This house is a striking example of a colonial period Anglo-Palladian work. It displays a handsome Palladian arch window over the front door. Also in Philadelphia is perhaps our most famous Palladian window on the Tower of Independence Hall. So if you need a reminder, just check your $100 bill. I think copying is illegal, but don't tell. Anyway, George Washington enjoyed a beautiful Palladian window in Mount Vernon's large dining room. And a 20th century version of it celebrates the entrance to UVA's Art Museum. And it decorates the entrance to a Franklin Street apartment house. Look for it as you drive down through VCU. And an elegant new classicism villa in the Bahamas. I didn't take this photo. I'm still waiting for an invitation. And more prosaically, the gable of a Robinson Street garage in the Fan District, now a shop. All right, but the best way to kill a good thing is to overkill it. This high-rise is by Philip Johnson, and I think he was just being too clever for his own good. So for a more genuine experience, please go see the Basilica in Vicenza. All right, this brings me to the final part of this discussion, Book 4 of Palladio's The Four Books. In this section, Palladio presented his restoration and reconstruction drawings of many ancient Roman temples and other public buildings based on his study of the ruins. In his foreword to Book 4, Palladio wrote, "I intend, therefore, to illustrate in this book the form and ornaments of many ancient temples, of which one can still see the ruins, and which I have recorded in drawings, so that anyone can understand the form and ornaments. And although one can see only portions of some of them standing above ground, I have nonetheless proceeded to deduce from them what they must have been like when they were complete." We're looking at 3 surviving columns of the Temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum. These 3 columns and bits of the foundation were all that Palladio had to work with. And from them, Palladio produced a credible conjectural elevation of the temple's original appearance, published in Book 4. It's difficult to overstress the importance of Palladio's efforts. It marked one of the first concentrated recording projects involving above-ground archaeological remains. The resulting published drawings of this and numerous other temples were amazing for the depth of their quality and comprehension. And it was a uniquely important effort, since it is mainly through many of Palladio's published images that we have any idea of the probable appearance of much of ancient Roman architecture. Moreover, Palladio's drawings are a priceless documentation, since various ruins that he recorded were subsequently quarried for their materials. For instance, we see here one of Palladio's restoration drawings for the temple of Nerva Trajan, the ruins of which were later pulled down for their materials. We know this building only through Palladio. The impact of these drawings has been staggering. They presented for the first time a credible vision of the grandeur and beauty of ancient classical architecture. So here we need to bring back Mr. Jefferson. Jefferson was the first American to make productive use of Book 4. Through his reading of Palladio's The Four Books, Jefferson was introduced not only to Palladio's villa designs and classical orders, but to the designs of ancient Roman temples in Book 4. When he was required by the Virginia, or requested by the Virginia General Assembly to provide a design for a new state capital, Jefferson turned to Palladio's illustration in Book 4 of the Maison Carrée in southern France for his inspiration. The Maison Carrée is the best preserved Roman temple, and it is the one Roman temple that Jefferson actually saw. At the time, Jefferson was living in Paris as our ambassador, and with the assistance of the French architect Charles-Louis Clarisseau, Jefferson worked up design drawings for the capital and commissioned a model. And these were sent to Richmond to guide the builders here, and this model is on display in the Capitol today. In this early view by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, we see how the Capitol originally dominated the town of Richmond like the Parthenon on the Acropolis. Its siting followed Palladio's advice for siting temples or major buildings, which he published in Book 4. Palladio wrote, quote, "But we should choose sites for temples in the most dignified and prestigious part of the city, far away from unsavory areas, such as Chaco Valley, and on beautiful and ornate squares where many streets end, so that every part of the temple can be seen in all its majesty and arouse devotion and awe in whoever sees and admires it. And if there are hills in the city, one should choose the highest part." Unquote. So here we have in Richmond a temple of democracy, a structure housing the oldest continuous lawmaking body in the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, noted here, the Virginia Capitol was the first time that the Republican form of government was given specific architectural expression. Also, the Capitol launched the American Classical Revival movement, and the Capitol established the precedent for using monumental classicism for American government and institutional buildings. And while there have been many studies of Roman ruins since Palladio, his drawings and commentary were a primary motivation for the continuation of the classical tradition in architecture and provided inspiration for many of the great classical works in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in what we call the American Renaissance. Go into any sizable city and you will find monumental classical works, governmental, institutional, and educational, that probably would not have existed or would have been very different if there had been no Palladio. And as I will illustrate, Washington, D.C., our national capital, best exemplifies this phenomenon. Arthur Brown Jr.'s central building of Washington's Federal Triangle is a stunning vision of Palladio's ideal of ancient Roman grandeur. Americans then thought of our country as a new Rome, an empire for liberty, and took the Roman image for its own. The National Archives is a fitting reliquary for the nation's two most precious documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The building's octastyle Corinthian portico compares with that on Palladio's reconstructed image of the temple of Castor and Pollux seen earlier. The portico and dome of the National Gallery of Art, our foremost temple of art, references the Pantheon. Its coffered ceiling in its domed hall follows that of the Pantheon as illustrated by Palladio in Book 4. Oh, where is it? There it is. So I'm sorry. See those domes looking alike? That was the point I'm trying to make. And appropriately, the Pantheon, as well as Jefferson's design of the UVA Rotunda, also is referenced in appropriately the Jefferson Memorial. And the great vaulted hall of Washington's Union Station was inspired by the vaults of the Basilica of Constantine, a ruin recorded by Palladio, and for which he published this conjectural restoration. And Palladio's temple drawings had their impact on America's most eminent Corinthian temple, the Supreme Court. As I said earlier, the Portico Temple was a design developed for buildings to house gods and to inspire awe. One cannot be helped being awed by a building that looks like this and have a sense of awe and respect for the institution it houses, we hope. The Supreme Court's portico drew inspiration from Palladio's Book 4 depiction of the temple of Mars Ultor in Rome's Forum of Augustus, as seen in this bookended view. Now, interesting, one building featured by Palladio in Book 4 is not an ancient monument. Rather, it's a Renaissance one, Bramante's Tempietto, a tiny structure in Rome completed in 1510. It commemorates the traditional site of St. Peter's crucifixion. Palladio was so taken with this architectural jewel that he was moved to include it in his treatise, and he placed his drawing of it in Book 4 among his ancient temple drawings. He stated his rationale for doing this as follows, quote, "Since Bramante was the first to make known that good and beautiful architecture, which had been hidden from the time of the ancients till now, I thought it reasonable that his work should be placed among those of the ancients. Accordingly, I have included the following temple designed by him on the Janiculum Hill," unquote. Now, Palladio was not the first to publish the Tempietto, but his drawings were more precise and the most widely disseminated. And by combining a surrounding colonnade and balustrade with a high drum topped by a dome and cupola, this novel scheme became the model for innumerable monumental domes worldwide, including the Paris Pantheon, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and St. Isaac's in Russia, and even the Capitolio in Havana, Cuba. And it had a profound impact in America, particularly on our state capitals. Some 15 state capitals are crowned with Tempietto-type dome. A sampling from left to right in the two rows includes Maine, Arkansas, California, Wisconsin, Texas, and Mississippi. And I'll throw in Utah for good measure. Of course, these state capitals all took a cue from America's foremost temple of democracy, our national capital. These domes and more can ultimately be traced to Palladio's illustration of the Tempietto in Book 4. Now, our nation's foremost temple of knowledge, the Library of Congress, is a vivid demonstration of Palladio's dictum for temples outside and within. He wrote in the introduction to Book 4, they must be, quote, they must be built of precious materials of the very highest quality. And if possible, they must be built so perfectly that one cannot imagine anything more beautiful. And so arranged in every part that those who enter them will be astonished and stand there with their spirits raised when contemplating their grace and beauty. Buildings such as these marked a culmination of Jefferson's effort to make monumental classicism, inspired by Palladio, the image of our public architecture, resulting in masterpieces that have so enriched our nation. Architects for which Jefferson set a precedent long ago with Virginia's capital, Palladio's ideal of a temple on the hill. In closing, I think it's appropriate to consider Palladio's personal character. What kind of guy was he? Well, we have a keen insight into Palladio as a very human individual through Paolo Gualdo's 1616 description. Like Jefferson, his love of architecture was infectious, and he was somebody you'd like to know. Gualdo wrote, quote, Palladio was a most extraordinarily able and attractive conversationalist, so he gave the most intense pleasure to the gentlemen and lords with whom he dealt. The same is true of the workmen he used, whom he kept constantly cheerful, treating them with so many pleasant attentions that they all worked with the most exceptional good cheer. He eagerly and lovingly taught them the best principles of the art in such a way that there was not a mason, stonecutter, or carpenter who did not understand measurements, elements, and rules of true architecture. He left many disciples, especially in his hometown of Vicenza. They subsequently, with recollections of Palladio's style, have built both public and private buildings that are very beautiful in that city and abroad, unquote. And as for abroad, we can certainly say that his disciples have built many beautiful public and private buildings in his style in America and indeed in Virginia. Finally, speaking for the Center for Palladian Studies, we might ask, what is Palladio's relevance to America's architectural practice? What does Palladio ask of us? What is his lesson? What is he telling us? Well, to use his own words, I think Palladio, above all else, continues to challenge us to build buildings so perfectly that one cannot imagine anything more beautiful, so that those who enter them will be astonished and stand there with their spirits raised. Thank you. Now, I'm told we have time for a few questions. Yes, ma'am. Mhm. She wants to know what I think about the proposed new East Wing that of the White House. Uh-huh. Well, I know the architect. He teaches at Catholic University. He's very much involved with the Center for Palladian. I mean, with the Institute of Classical Architecture. He's a good architect, actually. It's not going to be an illiterate use of the classical language. It seems to be getting bigger and bigger all the time. But anyway, and ironically, several years ago, I was the MC at an awards ceremony at Washington in the Cosmos Club that was by the Institute of Classical Architecture, giving them John Russell Pope Awards. That was the name of the honorary awards they were getting. And I personally presented the award to the architect of this ballroom wing. So he is a good friend, actually. Whether it should be done or not, I don't know. I do know that I think a larger room or a better room than a tent out on the lawn for entertaining heads of states could be a very useful amenity. End of. Well, there were a bunch of reviews that designs for the White House or changes the White House were supposed to go through, but those bodies were never consulted. I'm not going any farther than that. All right. Yes, sir. In Boston, downtown Boston. Yes, sir. Yeah, yeah. He had a son. God, what is his name? Um, anyway, his son inherited all his drawings, and they were purchased by uh, Inigo Jones, among others. And they ultimately ended up in the chats. Well, they ended up with Lord Burlington in the library at Chiswick House. And it's funny that Jefferson saw Chiswick House outside London, and he didn't like it for some reason. Little did he know that all of Palladio's drawings are down in the library of the house, and it just was close to him and never was aware of them. Anyway, the that family became intermarried with the Dukes of Devonshire. They ended up at Chatsworth, and from Chatsworth, they're on indefinite loan to, they were at the uh, Victoria and Albert Museum, but they are being moved to another location as we speak, and I'm not sure exactly where that is, but what was your question? Yeah, not that we know of. We know nothing much about him except the fact that he owned the drawings and did sell them. Some other question? Any other? Well, thank you for coming. I think, is the bar still open? Is the bar still open?
Bar is still open, and don't forget your membership